Right, should we try and get on with it, Ella?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Let's sit here. Next part. What about 20 something? Cool. So, hi everyone. Can everyone hear me? Sound good? Perfect. Okay. So, hello and welcome, and thank you for joining us for such an important event. Sorry, can everyone can everyone mute themselves who's not muted? Unless it's perfect. Thank you. So, hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for such a germane and important event. The aim of this evening is to equip our audience with some historical context on anti-Semitism and to elucidate the function of ideas of race and historical narratives within this phenomenon. There are few people as well suited to meet these objectives as our guest tonight, Professor Madge Dresser. To tackle these dense, complex, and indeed disputed issues, Madge will begin with a short address followed by some questions from me, which will then be opened up into the wider audience. The usual procedure for events such as this is for the speaker to send the organizer a brief biography in advance, which the chair then reads out, followed by the guest awkwardly thanking them for saying exactly what they had asked them to. As I've had the benefit of being personally affected by our esteemed guest's activism and scholarship, I would instead opt to briefly introduce Madge from a perspective gleaned from many interactions, both with Madge personally and with her extensive intellectual production. Although having lived in the UK since the 1970s, Professor Dresser was born and raised in Los Angeles, where she attended UCLA as an undergraduate and was briefly tutored by Angela Davis, no less. Her position as a student in the crucible of the civil rights movement, her crisscrossing of the Atlantic, and importantly, being the grandchild of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, have inflected her scholarly and activist career with a transnational focus and an abiding concern for race, ethnicity, and social change. The author of books like Slavery Obscured, Bristol, Ethnic Minorities in the City, and Women in the City, Madge has dedicated decades of historical research to aid our understandings of race, ethnicity, gender, and class in Bristol and beyond. This unyielding devotion to historical truths and marginalized narratives is perhaps best demonstrated by her 1986 study, Black and White on the Buses, a narrative history of the hitherto neglected Bristol bus boycott of 1963. Written in the context of Thatcherism, this book, which highlighted British racism and the bigoted tendencies of trade unions, stirred animosity on both sides of the political aisle. For young historians and critical thinkers more broadly, Madge's commitment to empiricism, anti-essentialism, and social justice in the face of bipartisan scrutiny is a model to be replicated and developed in an uncertain age of ethno-nationalism, fake news, and renewed socially induced misery. Therefore, we are more than lucky to have Madge here to deal with a topic drenched in both complexity and controversy. So without further ado, I will hand over to Madge to fill the gaping fissures in our understandings of anti-Semitism, race, and the politics of history.
Thank you, Kane, and I'll pay you later for that, okay? Thank you all for attending, and I hope this will be of interest to you. I think here we go, anti-Semitism, race, and the politics of history. I'm not going to be able to cover everything I would like, and so I want to be guided by you, through your questions to really focus in on the things that you feel are gaps in your understanding or areas of contention that you would like to challenge. Can we have the next slide, please? Right. So we know now that Black-Jewish relations are a very, very fraught topic, particularly now, and it's overlaid with wider issues that have arisen around Black Lives Matter, COVID, and global warming, because areas about attitudes to capitalism, to the management of the pandemic, to justice for the Palestinians in the light of recent developments with Israel and not so recent developments. All these have combined to make this issue really, really complex. And so on the right-hand side, we have the phenomenon of Jessica Krug of George Washington University, who posed as a radical Black scholar and then has been recently unmasked as someone who was a cultural parasite, in her own words. She took on the identity of a Black person, but she actually came from a Jewish family whose ancestry or whose association with them she denied. And what's behind that? And what does that mean? And is it simply, is there a complicated story behind that? We might want to unpack that. But obviously, this was one of the areas which really excited quite a bit of hostility under the whole issue about cultural appropriation. And on the left, of course, we have, and I hope I'm not betraying my age by mispronouncing his name, but it's Wiley, isn't it, guys? Right? And Wiley's narrative about Jews, his tweets and his pronouncements have it first excited very little opposition, if you like, within Black circles about this, but it has. And what is he saying? What is he talking about? He says that the real people that we should be addressing as Black people are the rednecks, the Ku Klux Klan, and Jewish people who control the law, the music industry, etc. He's associated Jewish people with the COVID, the outbreak of COVID. He's associated them with the police brutality around George Floyd, and he replicates many of the tropes which I'll later argue are derived from right-wing conspiracy theories, which have been recycled and refed into social media outlets and perceptions within Black circles, as well as others, progressive circles more widely, about the role of Jewish people in culture today. Can we have the next slide, please? And of course, Wiley's not the first. This is something that's been going on for quite a long time. And if you look at Ice Cube's pronouncements about read about the Jews who became slave traders, auctioneers, plantation owners, slave shippers, insurers, and financiers, and then studied the Jewish politicians who helped create and enforce the Jim Crow laws, the Jewish merchants who targeted Black cotton sharecroppers, growing extremely wealthy in the process, and the Jews who became Ku Klux Klan members and even suppliers of guns, sheets, and hoods to the Klan. Now, when one reads this as a Jew from my generation, this goes against the narrative that a lot of Jews in America particularly, and to a lesser extent England have, or Europe as a whole, associated themselves with. But Jews in England in America, who mainly, the vast majority came over in the 1870s and 80s, fleeing the anti-Jewish persecutions and poverty in Eastern Europe. They saw themselves as refugees who identified with the plight of other outliers, but they were very good at capitalism, or some of them were, and they came with certain skills at a very moment when the economy was needing garment workers, tailors, shoemakers, transport workers, all the things that Jews had done traditionally back in Eastern Europe. And so the economy was open, and quite a number of them flourished, whereas people from Ireland or from certainly African Americans did not flourish. They were agricultural workers at a time when agricultural opportunities were contracting. So the kind of fellow feeling that some Jews thought they had with Black people was an oversimplification and a romanticization of the relationship. And we can unpack that, and I can talk a bit about that. But what happened in the 1990s, of course, was Farrakhan and the publication of The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, which charged Jews with masterminding the slave trade, dominating the slave trade, and colluding in the oppression of Black people. And what it did is it overturned the romanticized and sincerely held view of many Jews in America that Jews were completely, had nothing to do with the slave trade, and when they did have anything to do with Black people, it was the civil rights marchers or people who supported Blacks. through philanthropy. I mean, for example, one of the founders, some of the founders of the NAACP were Jewish, and you have a disproportionate number of Jewish liberals supporting Black enterprises in the 19th and early 20th century. However, there is a much more complex stories about Jews and Blacks, because there are waves of Jews who came over from as refugees from the Spanish Inquisition in the 1490s and 1500s into the New World, some of whom were on the involved in the slave trade. But this is so in a way, Farrakhan did a service to us all in a horrible sort of way, because he made Jewish historians and others actually reinterrogate their own history in a much less romanticized way. But it is a deeply anti-Semitic work for reasons which I can talk. But he extrapolates to make Jews the absolute movers and shakers of a slave trade, which is simply not true, and we can talk about that if you like. Anyways, let's go to the next. Yeah, and now there are certain elements within Black social media and elsewhere which are conflating Jews with pedophiles, as pedophiles. The Harvey Weinstein and Epstein and Harvey Weinstein, are cases in point, but also the ritual practice, which they say has associated Jews historically with the sexual exploitation of children during the circumcision of male children, that rabbis were said to uniformly be required to suck the penis of the baby after it was bloodied. And we can talk about the truth about that. And like many things, it was a half-truth, but it's rooted, and many of these accusations have a small grain of truth, which are inflated and extended to all Jewish people as in a kind of way of demonizing them. And a lot of that rhetoric and a lot of those accusations are rooted in historic anti-Semitism, which go right back for thousands of years. And I'd like to talk a little bit about that as we proceed. Can we have the next? And one of the things that was a really important thing, how many of you, it would just be good to sort of have your hands up, how many of you have heard of the Blood Libel? Yeah, so I'm just, well, I can't see you all, but how many of you have not heard of the Blood Libel? Yeah, okay. Well, you really need to know about the Blood Libel, because it informs a lot of the anti-Jewish discourse, both in Black circles, but also in anti-Zionist circles. But it has its roots in Christianity. And the idea was, because Jews did not embrace Jesus as their savior, as the new Messiah, they were still waiting for the Messiah. Although Jews were, Jesus and his followers were not expelled or excommunicated from Judaism. The Essene group, of which he was a member, were only left or only were excommunicated after they failed to support Jews in a revolt against the Romans who had colonized them, 135 AD. But anyways, there was this idea that the Jews had killed Christ, and that also they ritually, with the circumcision, they ritually sacrificed children to make and use the blood of children to make matzah, which is the ritual bread, the unleavened bread that is used in the Passover ceremonies, which you might know as the Last Supper. Jesus was celebrating a Passover ceremony which celebrated the exodus of the Jews from enslavement in Egypt. And that's a ceremony that we still celebrate today. So here we have a medieval trope of this, but this is still being replicated, this idea of the Blood Libel in, well, there was a Syrian, I think it was a Syrian TV series. It's, today, and it's had a long history. It's been replicated in many different guises throughout the ages. Can we go on to the next? Yeah. And the other thing, the other thing you need to know is that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, what a lot of you know is the Old Testament, which says it's not the real Testament, it's not the real Word of God, but the Old Testament, which is comprised of the first 5 books of the Bible, plus all the way up to Kings and the Chronicles. This was accompanied in Jewish lore by the Talmud, and the Talmud was a collection. It's almost like a precursor of the web. It was a commentary on the Bible, but it had all the pages were they had marginalia, and people would say, oh, this interpretation of the Bible was good, and then another rabbi would say, no, I interpret it differently. So you have this kind of oral tradition around the interpretation of the Bible. So that's what the Talmud is, and there are different versions of it. And it is seen as in Christian circles as a deeply problematic and evil tract or evil body of knowledge. And that is something that was used by the Nazis as well. So you have here's in Die Stürmer, which is a Nazi journal, is building on this Christian theology, this anti-Jewish theology within Christianity, but using it for the purposes of the Nazis. And this kind of imagery is also replicated in modern day tropes that are anti-Jewish, that are sometimes found in progressive and left-wing circles as well. Okay, may I go on? Now, a lot of the tropes around anti-Semitism that are used in left-wing circles and in black circles and amongst people who are concerned about capitalism, etc., is the idea that Jews control the world economy. That's a world conspiracy. And this has its origins in something called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. How many of you have not heard of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion? Just so I get a sense. All right, so, okay. This was something derived or it was a forgery, an anti-Semitic forgery that purported to be a letter of Jews plotting to control the world economy. And it was later shown to be a complete forgery. And it was a 19th century document, but it gets replicated again and again and transmuted. So this isn't the Rothschilds, or well, it may be a trope on the Rothschilds, but you see how he's clutching the world globe and making blood. Blood and Jews are. The whole imagery of that is a whole other story that we could talk about, with people being crushed under the weight of their oppression. Okay, and if we go on, let's see, if we go on to the next, so I don't know how many of you know about the. I should just say the Rothschilds were a very important family, a banking family. They're not the only big bankers with the growth of capitalism, but they were confined to the ghetto in Frankfurt in the 18th century, and they clawed their way to wealth and lending money to people, and they're implicated now with the whole reparations payment when slave owners were compensated for the emancipation of slaves. The British government had to borrow money from someone and got it from the Rothschilds, and in order to pay off the slave owners. So it is seen that somehow the Rothschilds were responsible for enslavement, and we can unpack some of these things. But the imagery, the imagery of world Jewish conspiracies and Jews oppressing the poor has been replicated in this anti-Zionist mural, which was in Bristol, which one of my friends put up, one of my associates, and he thought it was a great thing. I don't know how many of you know this mural, but Jeremy Corbyn didn't see anything anti-Semitic about it, but the very Semitic-looking faces at the, and we'll interrogate what the term Semitic means, because that's racist in itself. Oppressing the poor who are underneath the game of Monopoly that they're playing. underneath. And you have all sorts of tropes here. And it wasn't seen as anti-Semitic because they didn't realize, or they chose not to realize, that these tropes go right back way before, the establishment of the State of Israel or what have you. And also, this particular slide, Street Artist Mir responds to the anti-Semitic painting hysteria, is on a David Icke website. And I don't know how many of you know who David Icke is, or David Icke, but he believes in a world that we're being controlled by people from, reptile people from outer space, but Jews who are pedophiles and manipulators of capital are part of this. And people as august as Alice, I've just had a senior moment, Alice Walker, and other people who really ought to know better subscribe to the David Icke views. And David Icke is actually a friend of the extreme right, but this has been, some of these things have been co-opted on the left as well in social media. Right, shall we just go to the next? I think we have one more slide, yes, yeah. Now, it's the whole notion of the imagery of the Jew as a spider or the octopus, or the tentacles in embracing the world, and that all Jews are somehow implicated with this, as if all Jews were as rich as the Rothschilds. I wish my family were. This was not something that was simply a Nazi trope or something that derives from the right. It was also co-opted by the Bolsheviks in the name of in the Soviet Union in the 1960s and before then. Now, there's a very complicated history about Jews and communism, because many Jews who suffered under the Tsarist regime, which enforced Jews to be converted and were confined Jews to a pale or ghetto of settlement, a pale of settlement, and were deeply anti-Semitic because of their own Christian ideology in the Orthodox Church. Many Jews embraced Bolshevism and the communist revolution. Not the majority, but a minority of important intellectuals, and they were very important. So you did have some leading figures within the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, fast forward to the 1960s in the Soviet Union, although Russia did, or the Soviet Union did endorse the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, it soon turned it soon reverted back as people were, people like, even before the 60s, in the 1930s, Stalin, who led Russia in the 1930s, he had, although he was a Bolshevik in name, he also retained many of the old Greek Orthodox prejudices against the Jews, and persecuted many Jews and executed many Jewish Bolsheviks in purges and phony trials. And by the 1960s, you get the victimization of Jewish intellectuals in Soviet doctors and people like that, people sent into insane asylums under the guise that they were subverts and crazy people. And you get this kind of propagandas which derives from these older tropes of anti-Semitism. And many of the Jews, including some of the right-wing the Jews who came out of Russia to Israel in the 1980s and 1990s, and including people who no longer identified as Jews, like Abramovich, were heirs of this kind of political context. So what I'm trying to say is that some of the anti-Semitic tropes, which are grounded in kernels of truth inflated to demonize the whole people, are found on both the left and the right. Can I fast forward? Now, the other question I think is quite interesting about who are the Jews and how much power do they have, and I think you'll see some of the are Jews white? How do we divide the different Jews? And you'll have people from Vidal Sassoon to Sacha Baron Cohen to Zuckerberg to some of the Google people who are Jewish. So, what does this say about the Jewish grip, on culture, and what are their respective roles? And are these the only Jews? Because increasingly it's being recognized that Jewish identity is not simply Ashkenazi. There are Sephardi Jews who are from Spain, but originally from North Africa, and who were expelled, and the Mizrahi Jews who were in Syria and Babylon for thousands of years, Greek and Roman Jews. You had Ethiopian Jews who predate, they go right back to thousands of years to the Queen of Sheba. So, who are the Jews? And increasingly, we're having a reinterrogation about Jewish identity. Jews are also divided by their religious adherents. Are they simply a religious group? No longer. There are many Jews, many people who identify as Jewish who are atheists. Are they an ethnic group? Are they a race? I would say emphatically they're not a race. But who are they? And of course, there is a whole trope within Black circles that the so-called white Jews are really intruders, and that the real Jews were sub-Saharan Africans. So, thank you for some of the people explaining some of these terms. So next, I think there's one more slide. Yes. So here are some of the different people who are now identified as Jewish, and we have people who are of mixed parentage, who identify or who have converted as Jews. Maybe their mother or their father was Jewish. There are those who live and brought up in America and who have experienced both anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, from Jews and Blacks respectively. You have people from Ethiopia, including in the lower left-hand corner, people who are transported, rescued really from persecution in Ethiopia to Israel, and who then faced discrimination within Israel amongst other Jews. You have some interesting cases of, and then on the lower right-hand side, you have some of the Ethiopian Jewish mothers protesting against police brutality within Israel. You have also some really interesting identities. For example, the Lemba Cultural Association. These people are in Uganda, and they say they had Jewish ancestry, and nobody believed them. And they had certain rituals which they kept, and a genetic test was made, and indeed they do have a certain marker which associates them with the Kohanim, which is a priestly caste within ancient Judaism. So are they, can they come to Israel as Jews or not? And there's a whole sort of controversy about that. But throughout Africa, there are groups who identify as Jews, and some have, and can we really identify Jews genetically? So that's a whole other can of worms. But there obviously was a lot of migration and intermixing throughout history. So the ethnic and racial, I don't like the term race, it's construct, but the kind of boundaries between who is a Jew or who is Black is much more porous and historically contingent than we would like to think. So anyways, I've talked quite a while at the moment, but I just want to show this last slide. I'm sorry it's so offensive and shows such awful tropes. And one of the things that I should have had a spoiler alert is that I would use in the discourse and the discussion that we'll have historic terms which are offensive now, and which if you use, you get canceled, because, if you talk about colored people or Negroes or what have you. But these were the terms used at the time, and so if you're going to examine things historically, you need to see how terms were used at the time to understand and unpack some of the racial or racist attitudes and anti-Semitic attitudes. Now, I thought this was quite an interesting trope. It brought one student, a couple people, in tears when I was showing it to reduce some people in tears. This is a white supremacist cartoon. And on the top, it shows the 1960s, where it had the whole idea that Jews were overrepresented in the civil rights movements. Relative to their numbers, there were a disproportionate number of Jewish people who supported the civil rights movement. Not to say all people, all Jews, but a disproportionate number did, particularly in America. And so you have a caricatured Ashkenazi Jew with equal rights now, with his hand up raised, and with his arm patronizingly around a horribly caricatured black person, and then another Jewish person, squat and fat and end bigotry, and also characterized. So that's the 1960s. And now, of course, alluding to the increasing tensions between blacks and Jews, they say, isn't it pathetic that, or isn't it poetic justice that blacks and Jews now can display utter contempt for all Jews and also consider them their foremost oppressors since slave days? And so, and indeed, if you look at Wiley, some of these right-wing tropes are being recycled within left-wing and black circles. So there's a lot to unpack. I've sort of rushed through and did injustice to all sorts of histories and nuance, etc. I think I would rather just pause it now, if you are amenable, and just sort of say that one of the things that we need to do as a group of people who want social justice, which I presume means all of us, is to have a culture where we can discuss things in an honest way and not cancel people out if they are don't use the right rhetoric. Because if we all accept that we have all been raised black and white in racist culture and colonialist cultures, that we're going to imbibe certain attitudes and internalize them, albeit in the whole idea is to reflect critically upon them, and to be patient with each other up to a point. Nuance can be the enemy of social action and change, so I take that on board. But I think it's quite important for us to re-examine the historic relationship between blacks and Jews, to look at some of the visual tropes that are being employed throughout history and in different guises, and to be more critical about them. And I think I'll just end there, if I may. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thanks, Madge. That was really interesting. I've heard you speak about these topics for a while now, and it's just there is so much to cover. We're talking about hundreds of years of history, and also the complexities of especially and you talk about there's always a nugget of truth. There's always like a little kernel of truth to a lot of these tropes, and the need to kind of tease them all out and kind of get to the truth and undermine the kind of white supremacist claims that kind of undergird so much of anti-Semitism in the present, but also of anti-blackness and how these things come into each other. Before I open up to I think you're right, Madge, that it's best to kind of have this dialogue be informed by the audience. But I just wanted to ask one question, especially because you mentioned and one of the topics of this talk, and you mentioned race and this idea of the need to undermine race. So how can we kind of simultaneously undermine anti-Semitism whilst refusing race as a construct? So how can we refuse race and refuse anti-Semitism at the same time? And why is there? And you mentioned it as a construct. Why is it necessary to undermine race?
Well, would you say undermine race or undermine racism?
Well, race as a construct of as you mentioned, as the idea of pure biological realities and the differences of humans, if that makes sense.
Right. Well, a couple points here, and first of all, race is a construct. We know that there are we know now that there are probably bigger differences between, there are genetic differences between people, but they interact with the environment, and it isn't on color. So if you look at West Africa or somewhere like Kenya, there are huge there are discernible differences, maybe in disease probabilities, or running, or what the ability to run, and all that sort of thing, which are a complex interaction between the environment and genetic predispositions. So, for example, Ashkenazi Jews have a particular predisposition to get something called Tay-Sachs syndrome, which is a horrible genetic disease, just as certain Black people have sickle cell anemia vulnerability. But that isn't all Black people, and it isn't, what does it tell us anyways? And to what extent is it something that evolved in interaction with the environment? These things are really, no one wants to talk about genetics now because it's associated with eugenics and racism, etc. So race is something that is, wrongly conflated with some simplistic idea of, you're one color and you're one race, and you're another color and you're another race. And actually, our interactions with biological difference in the environment and everything are really complex and multivarious. So that's one thing I would like to say. I don't know whether that addresses what you meant, but as you've pointed out, Kane, people do experience, you can say race doesn't exist, but people do experience themselves as racialized people because of the interactions and the response they get from others, and so do so do other groups. One point I would make is that it's really important, particularly at this moment, in my view, to foreground anti-Black racism, and particularly we have a moment here with the convergence of Black Lives Matter, the anti-colonialist movement, the exposure of police brutality, the differential rates of Black people in terms of their vulnerability to COVID, and all this sort of thing. It's all coming together, and we could move to actually, by prioritizing race is something to, and anti-Black racism to be attacked, can make some real structural differences. We have a moment of opportunity. It might not last. So that's really important. But to sort of say that's the only form of injustice or inequity in persecution is not right, and it will breed division. So you have white working class people saying, "What about us? We are the victims of corporate capitalism, and we're being unemployed, etc." And the whole trope with anti-Semitism and anti-Black racism, I would say two things. One is, I think within many Black circles, you're saying, well, what are these bloody Jews complaining about? They're much better off than we are, and they got reparations, and here we're still, suffering, and they want to talk about anti-Semitism all the time. They're not vulnerable like we are. Their life chances aren't really under threat, despite some of these incidents of hate crime. And what I would say, I went to a recent talk by a guy who was a Tutsi, and it was only because he was a football star that he didn't get murdered during the genocide of the Tutsi people in Rwanda. Okay. And the Tutsis were a kind of elite within Rwanda, and economically and politically, etc. And the Hutus who rose up against them, and there's a whole story about how much of that was fomented by the colonists who fomented and divided and ruled the Rwandan people. But anyways. You would have thought the Tutsis, they had all the power. They were sort of like the Jews in Nazi Germany. There were poor Jews, but there were a lot of wealthy Jews and middle-class Jews. 60% of Warsaw's doctors were Jews in 1939. 60%, right? How can these people be vulnerable? It only takes a campaign of dehumanization and feeding on other people's resentments because they feel they've not got. They've been economically disadvantaged, to dehumanize people and turn the tables and set the scene for genocide. And Jews of all Jews of all political and religious beliefs are very sensitive to that. They've got their antennae out, and that's why you get what you might see as the hysterical reaction to the kind of dehumanizing discourses that are being used. So just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you, is what I would say in this context. So privilege is not an insurance policy against genocide, okay, or economic well-being or what have you. And and also I would say that the very same tropes that are used to demonize Jews have also been used to demonize Black people. And we can talk about, the criminality, too loud and too expressive, a lot of different stereotypes have been used in common to other the people. And what we're talking about is othering other groups, okay? And not seeing these people with their own individual and complex stories. And that cuts both ways. So I hope that goes some way too.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. And yeah. So just wanted to open up to the wider audience. Does anyone have any questions? Ellis, do you want to start?
Hiya. So you touched earlier on sort of how anti-Semitic rhetoric can bleed into into social media and a lot of left-wing ideologies, perhaps. Or I was just wondering if you had any guidance for people who are concerned about social justice issues, the dog whistles to look out for.
Well, first of all, the whole term anti-Semitic is interesting because I think in some circles, we can't be anti-Semitic. We're all, people concerned about justice for the Palestinians, and rightly so, would say we can't, or people in Muslim groups, we can't be anti-Semitic because we're Semites too. But it's interesting that the term Semite is a racist term coined by geneticists, a language group, and it was a way of categorizing people according to a language group which was based on racialist theories. So the whole idea of the way we even talk about these things is problematic. It's a really big tough about how do you educate yourself. I think the first thing is to consider to call people up and how did you get this evidence? What's your source? What specific time period are you talking about? And I think it's where your evidence is. Now, part of the problem about evidence and the whole Western idea of empirical and scientific investigation, that's being discredited a lot now because in the Enlightenment, on which all these critical theories were, or a lot of these critical methods of empirical research and deductive reasoning were launched, is seen as a kind of Western imposition, and because it does exclude the capturing of reality for a lot of people who express themselves through art and music and through folklore and through family lore and the emotionality of human experience. So it also Enlightenment theory, and by saying it, we have to use Enlightenment principles in the appliance of science, is also a Western view of what's, how science evolved, because it owed a hell of a lot to Chinese and Middle Eastern and Incan and other, people in its evolution. But that aside, I think we need to ask ourselves, is this looking at all the evidence? Is this particular, accusation looking at all the evidence? Is it contradictory? And is it located in a particular time and place? So I do think critical method and being critically reflective is something we all need to embrace in regard to the sort of Trumpian, disinformation that we have on both the right and the left at the moment, but particularly on the right. I don't know whether that seemed a bit garbled to me. There's so much to talk about because we're at the cusp of what is truth. At the moment, we don't know how we capture human reality and how we verify it. And of course, when we're talking about human beings, everybody's got their own take, their own experience of human emotions. And, what are you thinking right now in your head is part of your reality? How do you capture that, for the historical record? And so it makes it, you can what can happen and what's so dangerous is you can say everybody's story is of equal validity. So, if you deny the Holocaust, well, that's your take on it. That's equal. That's the way you see the world. That's cool. And I think at some point we have to sort of, I guess it's a philosophical question. We have to say, where do we draw the line about that? And what kind of society do we want to live in? And what kind of myths or what kind of stories do we want to embrace? Because in the end, we're all telling stories to each other.
So, does anyone, that's really interesting, there's a lot to unpack within that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. My head's exploding with this all, as you can see. I have to write a few little essays on specific points.
We could just expound on that, but I just want to get some more people involved in the conversation. Does anyone have any points? Just stick your hand up. Anyone? Am I just not seeing anyone? Or is everyone being shy?
Are people feeling too intimidated that they don't know enough to ask, or they don't want to say the wrong thing?
I actually got a message from Moses, who was here earlier, but he had to leave. But he sent me a message to say that if he could have stayed, he would ask this. So I can just read that out. So sorry, let me just find it. If I could stick around, I would ask something like, what role do white supremacists and the far right play in sowing division between black people and Jews in order to deny their shared oppression?
Oh, that's a really good question. I heard on the radio today, there's been a really good expose on Radio 4 series about the extreme right in America at the moment and all these survivalist groups, et cetera. And one of the things that one of the tactics that the right used or has used historically is to desecrate. Let me just get this straight in my head so I say it coherently. Is to desecrate a Jewish cemetery, okay, and then they'll get a bunch of people, horrified. Most white, non-Jews would be horrified at this. But there'll be a few who aren't. Okay, and then they can recruit people like that, and then I was thinking about the desecration of Scipio Africanus's tomb. That some of you will know, the headstone in Bristol that purported to be of a black servant, and it's been desecrated, and that has it was done by a far right group, we think, but it this is a way of sowing division, and also. Making people divide and polarize in a way that people aren't speaking to each other. So I think there are some strategies that are being employed by far right groups in order to to foment anti-black feeling and to make it more acceptable, and anti-Semitic feeling to make it more acceptable, but also to cause divisions between blacks and Jews. It serves them well. It serves them well.
Are there any more questions? I have a couple. If everyone's being quiet, but if anyone has a burning question, please let me know. Okay. Well,
could I just sort of say something about Jews and the plague?
Yeah. Please do.
All right. Well, I mean, Jews have been accused. I mean, now there are things about COVID, being, big pharma, which is supposedly completely controlled by Jews, having its interest in COVID and all this sort of thing. This, leaving aside, corporate capitalism and big pharma's, profit-driven motives, the whole thing about Jews poisoning the wells and causing plague has gone on for centuries, and Jews have been burnt alive for supposedly, being the purveyors of plague. So this goes way back, and it's what I think it was James Baldwin who talked about Stranger in the Village, that wonderful essay where he was the only black person in a Swiss village, and everyone was very nice to him until there was a theft in the village. And all of a sudden, he was the guy who stood out. He wasn't one of us, okay? So he was the one suspected the theft. Okay, and it's that kind of, if you're culturally different and you stand out and you don't share the religion, what have you, and you have all these suspicions about your attitudes towards Jesus and the death of Christ and all that, and perhaps you are also involved with medicine and herbal remedies and things, as many Jews were. The whole idea of poisoning the well and spreading the plague has a long antecedent. Okay.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And if anyone hasn't read Stranger in the Village, it's a terrific read, as everything, James Baldwin puts to paper is. But you can find that in the Notes of a Native Son, if anyone's interested. But it's a really good read for understanding otherness, which is a big theme here. It's one way of doing it that's more interesting than most. Madge, I want to kind of push you on something that we might have some disagreement on. And maybe just kind of talk this through about the kind of political uses of anti-Semitism. And I don't want to kind of get lost in Corbynism and that kind of historical juncture, but this I've seen a lot of kind of right-wing utilization of anti-Semitism, and for me, as someone who is engaged in the fight against it, I see that as mainly as a kind of as undermining the root cause. When it has such a political use, and not saying there's ever a non-political use of it, but in such a direct sense, it does undermine what we're trying to achieve, especially when it is, it's so transparently partisan, especially with to use Corbyn, the valid criticism of Jeremy Corbyn writing a foreword to J. Hobson book, which, as you know, is just seeped in anti-Semitism about Jews controlling the world and imperialism, and that using that to bolster the campaign of Boris Johnson, who wrote 72 Virgins or whatever it's called, which had characters in it which were like hook-nosed Jews and so on and so forth. So how do we address the political uses of anti-Semitism when we are talking about it as a subject, and how do we not let that kind of become the center of our focus?
Well, first thing is to understand the dynamics around the whole thing about Corbynism and the chief rabbi who's a Tory, exploiting and telling people how to vote and all this sort of thing. I'd say a few things. One is on the left, the hostility to people in trade and all forms of capitalism, I think predisposes a lot of people on the left to dislike Jews. Now, Jews historically have been, not every Jew is a capitalist. A lot of people are artisans or teachers or doctors or what have you. But they were historically banned from owning land throughout most of Europe, etc. And they were pushed into the petty trades. And the association of particularly Eastern European Jews with capitalism was very distasteful to a lot of people on the left, okay, because they don't like any form of capitalism, okay, and I think this is an interesting thing, because we may need to address our attitudes towards capitalism now that we know that small entrepreneurs, many of whom are Black or family-owned firms, are being exploited by the Amazons and corporate capitalists of the world as much as the workers, because they have to pay all sorts of bounties and be controlled, etc. So the left may have to reformulate how it can oppose corporate capitalism, the big monopoly capitalists, with small entrepreneurs. And do we need capitalism as a nimble and supple, can-do and pragmatic source of creativity and individualism to help us combat climate change and COVID and all that? That's a whole other story, but we are redrafting our whole attitudes towards economics. Now, sorry, I veered away from answering your question, but I think there was, with a number of people on the left, there was a lot of residual snobism and anti-Semitism that wasn't really acknowledged in their attitude towards the Jews who came over from Eastern Europe. They were okay as long as they were trade unionists and repudiated any form of trade, but they weren't okay if they were traders themselves. The second thing I would say is that it's absolutely right that the whole anti-Semitism thing was hijacked by Tory interests. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't anti-Semitism within the Labour Party. And also, many of the people who rallied against it, in the Jewish community and then left Labour, just felt uncomfortable with the denial of some of the dynamics and the way in which rabidly anti-Semitic people were allowed to victimize some of the people on the right of the Labour Party. So that to understand that it is an important thing. So just because it's been hijacked by the right, and we should call that out, and to bolster up the anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim racism, etc., on the part of the Conservative Party, doesn't mean it doesn't exist on the left. And I think if we acknowledge that, then people can relax a little bit and actually have an honest conversation about this. And then a number of people in the... Now, I'll stop there because I'm not giving you a very wonderful answer. And it's because I'm writing something about this at the moment. I just think there's been disingenuousness on both sides of the story, or on all sides of the story. People are being disingenuous. For example, any kind of thing that Corbyn might say or somebody on the left might say will be taken to show complete anti-Semitism and by the Jess Phillips of the world or other people in the right of the Labour Party or people who have left the Labour Party. But it's equally true that you get a nose for the kind of tolerance of anti-Semitism. And nose is perhaps an unfortunate metaphor to use. That is being denied on the left, absolutely being denied. And so although the people who are combating anti-Semitism from the middle of the Labour Party or from the right are sometimes making too much of a particular incident, it's true on the left as well. So I think we have to be much more cogent. I mean, I went to an interesting group convened by John Mann, who's not Jewish, on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. And we had a bunch of Jewish people who were there who are very anti-Zionist and completely in denial that Corbyn has any truck with anti-Semitism, etc., who were not listening to some of the experiences of other people. And what John Mann said, I thought was quite interesting. He said that he never gets, the only time he gets abuse of postbags really is if he ever talks about the Jews or anti-Semitism. And that's when he really gets a huge amount of abuse, personal abuse. And the kind of personal abuse that some of the Jewish women, some of whom had been in the Labour Party for years, like, on the other hand, Diane Abbott gets a lot of abuse as well, okay, so in hate threats, etc. But the kind of abuse and dehumanization that was tolerated, that these people received, was just unconscionable. And so I think we really need to be honest about this kind of trajectory.
I have a lot to say, but again, I do want to.
Come on back. Come on.
No. I don't disagree with any of that. I do think that we're in the same way we need to address the US right co-opting Martin Luther King as a centrist kind of figure who was against the idea of talking about racism. We need to take anti-Semitism away from the Tories because they don't care about it. And then there was so many examples when they had the unveiling of that statue of that Nazi sympathizer who was I think one of the first female MPs,
Oh, yes, yeah. Oh, yeah.
The same week.
Not Astor, yeah, Nancy Astor, yeah.
Yeah. Who used to always talk about how blue Hitler's eyes were and stuff like that. I mean, and they're unveiling her statue in the same week they're telling us how bad Corbyn is, and I think that
they're complete hypocrites. Make no mistake, absolutely double think, etc. But that
doesn't take away from the lived experience of Jews in the Labour Party at all, or on the left more broadly. I completely agree, but I do think we have to address, when we're addressing anti-Semitism, we need to censor how it can be, and how it is co-opted in exactly the same way where Trump, and you use the US example again, Trump would talk about how immigrants are taking jobs away from African Americans. And so, pretending to care about African Americans for a couple of minutes. And in the last event Air UK had, we talked about how class can be used to talk about black people without talking about black people. So you can talk about how, low-income families are ruining this area. What you mean by that is black. And so it's about, we need to make our narratives more streamlined so that they can't be co-opted in this way. And I think that someone like yourself should talk more, not to attack what you're doing, about how we make our narratives, our anti-racist narratives, bulletproof to these kind of uses, if that makes sense.
Well, a little. I'm not quite sure. I'm clear about this. I think my aha moment, being raised in a racist culture, when I was a kid. Although we, as Jews, we always felt we weren't quite white, and I don't think we were until the '60s. We knew we were in between all these different oppressed groups, and as Malcolm X pointed out, that if it weren't for the blacks, the Jews might get it. And Jews were, I think, aware of that, of their liminal status. And then when I went to Britain, and I saw that many of the same tropes being brought against black people, they're shiftless, they drink too much, they're into drugs, they're violent, all that kind of stuff, was used against Glaswegians, right? And I realized class was the big element. Americans were good at recognizing race, but they were not so good about class. They're getting better now because the class inequities are so apparent, between the wealthy and the poor now. I guess we need to show how these things all intersect. The problem is if you we need to seize the moment to achieve racial justice right now, to address the intrinsic racism of things. But if we don't talk about class and gender, etc., we're going to end up with a critique which can be oppressive as well.
Completely. Ellis,
Hi.
And if anyone has a question, as we said earlier, and doesn't feel competent saying it, just put it in the chat, and I'll read it out. Sorry, Ellis, you go ahead.
So me and Lily are helping out by putting some definitions of things that are being used into the chat, and we're just doing sort of quick Google copy and paste so we can stay engaged in the whole thing. And then when I went to bring up a definition for anti-Zionism, it was almost impossible. And there was every other article said completely contradicting things, and even their title would be anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, and then the next one was anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. So I'm just wondering if you could give your insight into it and maybe why there is so much. It's a big question, so I won't ask why there is so much discourse around that, but yeah.
And this is the problem, because if you really get to grips with something, it's hard to put it in the public arena, where simple answers are wanted. Zionism, which is the idea that, Israel was the homeland of the Jewish people and they were exiled from it, and that they have a particular attachment to it, has a lot of different meanings throughout the ages. And most Jews were not particularly Zionist before the 1880s. But they did have an attachment, a spiritual attachment to Israel, and every year at our Seder, our Passover meal, say next year in Jerusalem, the return, this feeling of loss, etc. But there was, how do you, once you had the ending of the ghettos and things were supposed to get better for Jews. In the 1900s, you have this resurgence of anti-Semitism, and so a lot of Jews said, "Well, what do we have to do in order to, have decent life chances?" And some turned to Bolshevik or socialism and anarchism. A disproportionate number of Jews were anarchists in the 1880s. Some turned to extreme religion. They render unto Caesar what Caesar, and just be religious and retreat into a super orthodoxy or extreme orthodoxy. Others became liberals, and others became Zionists, and there were all sorts, or imperial. Some of them went to the Ottoman Empire and colluded with that empire. So you had all different types of strategies about how best to, be part of political life. And it really wasn't until the 1917 and then 1945. I mean, it's been said that, Hitler did foster Zionism at one level. So you had different strategies. Now, I found, to my absolute astonishment, because I thought my forebears were sort of socialists, not Bolshevists, but, sort of socialists. My great-grandfather took his family in the 1870s to Palestine. He was a Zionist, and he didn't get to Palestine. He died in Turkey, and the family was left in Turkey. But he thought that was the only way forward. So Zionism meant different things to different people. So there's no simple answer to all that, and even within the so not all Jews are Zionists. So if you look at many Jews on the left are anti-Zionist, but most Jews have some sort of attachment to Israel, and particularly because so many Jews in Israel, 5 million Jews, were either refugees from the Holocaust. Were they supposed to go back to Europe? Some of them did and got murdered. Back to Eastern Europe. Are they supposed to go to America? Well, America had quotas on Jews then. Were they supposed to go back to the countries from which they were expelled in the 50s, in Egypt and Syria, where they had lived for thousands of years? So, where are these Jews supposed to go? So a lot of Jews who may not, like the idea of the law of return and they certainly don't like Netanyahu, are loath to become completely anti-Zionist in that way, because they do feel that Israel's being singled out, and the left doesn't have an answer to where these Jews are supposed to go. So Zionism can mean different things. So how do you get a simple definition of this? I think one of the things you can do is try to educate yourselves, because you guys are opinion leaders, and at least bring some nuance to some of these debates. I mean, I do notice one thing. A lot of the people coming here, I would have loved to see more people from the African Caribbean, of African Caribbean background, or from Muslim backgrounds coming to this, to this debate. Where are they? And why? And I expect that a lot of people who are here may be of Jewish extraction. They're very interested in these areas. So, why is there this resistance to engage? Is it because it's seen as a side issue or a kind of diversion against, from the main priority, which is anti-racism? And I guess my contention is you can't have anti-racism without combating anti-Semitism.
That kind of leads on to an element of what you said there leads on to one of the questions put in the chat by Emily, who basically just asked for recommendations for further reading on the topics discussed, whether it's books, articles, documentaries, etc. So in terms of how we can educate.
Right. Well, I do have a couple of things to give you. I mean, I think one of the daunting problems about this is there's too much bloody literature. Everyone's an expert on Israel. You can never master, the history of Zionism for a start, because everyone's got their own take on history, and in the end, it's which narrative you choose to believe. Okay, at one level, but of course, there. Somebody just told me about a really good course, which I think I've sent you the link, but I can send some links to people to help. And it really depends on which aspect you want to educate yourself about. Is it the history of the Jews? Who are the Jews? What about these blood libel things? Or what about Zionism? So if you can be specific, I can send you specific links, okay? But there are some really good short courses you can do, and there are some decent websites which give some considered discussions. For example, I mean, there's a guy, I've just been reading a chap named Toby Green, who he's a historian of West Africa, but he's also somebody who knows the griots of West Africa, and he does a lot of stuff on music, and he's looking at the role of Jewish communities within the slave trade as well as others, and he's the best kind of historian in the world, but he's a tough read. It's very hard to simplify these things without sacrificing it's hard to be simple, all right? But it's better if you guys are simple, having read as much as you can, and then if you distill a story that's you can put in the public arena that people will understand. At least it's based on some knowledge. Whereas if you just listen to conspiracy theories and you don't research, then you're replicating really destructive narratives.
It's really important. A lot of it is so nuanced that it's hard to capture. And I think one of the really good voices, Paul Gilroy pays a lot of attention to the black and Jewish relationships historically and contemporary. But, you don't have to go into detail, but it's not his work isn't always, because he deals with such complex issues, it's not always the easiest to read. But I do think there's just some things that can be quite illuminated quite easily. So, for example, earlier you mentioned about the lack of land ownership, or the precluding of land ownership through anti-Semitic. And I think that not minor, but historical narratives like that are important to understand things like Jewish involvement in the slave trade, or why Jewish communities were involved in certain capitalist endeavors. So maybe just if you could talk about a couple of those kind of historical narratives which put Jews in certain positions, which are the basis for some of these tropes, if that makes sense.
Okay. Well, again, we have to look at specific times in history, because if you have this overarching generalization, Jews were always banned from owning the land, that's not true, or what kind of farmers they were, or what have you, or Jewish attitudes towards land ownership. When Jews were expelled and they from Palestine, Roman Palestine, and they dispersed all over, and they weren't allowed. They could only come to certain European countries on the behest of the local ruler, or what have you. They had to perform a function, and one of the functions that rulers had in medieval times was that usury, i.e., lending at interest, was prohibited by the Christian Church. Okay. And so they allowed Jews and other outgroups, it wasn't just the Jews, but Jews, that they could come on a condition that they were the money lenders, but they couldn't own land, and they were not allowed to enter artisan trades, because in those days, to become like a silversmith or a cloth maker or what have you, you had to join a guild, which was kind of like a trade union, but it was Christian. So you had to take Christian oaths. So they were precluded from doing much, a lot of these things. And they weren't allowed to own at least in theory, not allowed to own land. You did, in practice, get some Jews who were wealthy enough to subvert some of these restrictions, but most Jews were pushed into these. They were not allowed to amass land because it was seen as a threat to the existing power. Not all Jews were moneylenders, but what would happen is that the rulers would get the Jews to lend money because you needed cash. Let's say in England in the 1100s, okay, and people needed cash to buy stuff and to maintain their lifestyles, etc. And exorbitant rates of interest were charged. And then what happened was when the Jews got the money, the king would tax the Jews and take most of the money from the Jews. So what would happen is everyone would hate the Jews for being the for being the money lenders, but it was the crown that ultimately got the money, okay, or most of the money, okay. It isn't to say there weren't some wealthy Jews, but by the time Jews were expelled from England in 1290, and all Jews were expelled from England and not allowed to return until the 1650s. If you were a Jew in England, it was illegal. Most of the Jews were impoverished and they left with clothes on their back. And because they had been taxed to that. And you had that kind of thing replicated throughout history. Now, I'm not saying that there weren't wealthy Jews, because there were, but again, there was this relationship between, they weren't allowed to settle and be farmers in that way. Now, there were a few Jewish farmers, say in Transylvania, for example, but they got decimated during the Holocaust. But most of the time they were not peasants; they were traders or artisans or scholars, and that was or peddlers, people like that, pawnbrokers, people like that. And so they had more of a commercial mind. And one of the things that Jews had, which most people didn't in those days, was the Jewish men had supposedly to be literate. They had to read at least Hebrew in order to be bar mitzvahed. Now, being literate gives you an advantage in terms of being able to do business and to avail yourself of certain opportunities, but it also makes you an object of suspicion amongst the peasantry, who are just being told what to do and by the church or what have you. So culturally, Jews had a difference between rural landowners.
Yeah, again, really interesting, and there's a lot more to be said on that. I just want to get through a couple of the more questions that have been put. One's from Josie, who says it's a bit of a tangent, which I don't think it is totally. Wondered what your opinions were about using social media to share information and to incite political action. I think it's quite, not to mention your age, but you're someone who's worked or been involved in anti-racism both before the internet and during its in its wake now. So I mean, maybe you could talk about that comparatively, relatively briefly, if that's okay.
Well, it's a mixed bag, isn't it? On the one hand, it's a vehicle for spreading hatred and false information at an unprecedented level. On the other hand, it's a democratization of knowledge. And so you can learn about this stuff, and you can, if you get the right sources to find out, the different debates about the history of the Jews or the history of Black people, what have you, you can uncover stories at an unprecedented level, and you can do so from a tent in Uzbekistan, and you can, it's potentially a liberating force. But the two things I don't like about it is it's a simplifying force. And I think when you read and you're too much on social media, it jazzes you up that you don't have the repose to actually read stuff. And I think you access things differently on a screen when you read a book, and you have more time for reflection. So it really depends on the wisdom with which we use this stuff and the controls that we put on hate speech. And it's really very difficult because I'm against cancel culture. I really think that we need to keep talking to each other, but I also know that that's a trope, freedom of speech, and let's preserve and have everybody on a platform, etc., that can be used to legitimate and spread disinformation and racism too, because it's being cynically used in some quarters. So, so in terms of social media, the fact that I'm not a master of TikTok and Instagram, and I can just about do Twitter, and Facebook has, it's amazing because you can reach constituencies that you never could reach, and garner untold stories and find out more about people's lived experience at an unprecedented level. Fantastic. But it comes at a price.
Definitely. And I would love to see you on TikTok, Madge. That would be incredible. So Harry Jones, there's a couple, I think we've got time for one or two more. So Harry Jones asked, I've noticed language used to discuss Israel-Palestine increasingly draws comparisons with that of the South African apartheid. Oftentimes people specifically using the Afrikaans term apartheid. Do you think this type of language inflates tensions between Black and Jewish communities? That's a very good question, Harry. Do you want to try and tackle that as best as you can?
Yeah, well, where do I go? And it was so disappointing to hear Bishop Tutu, embrace that analogy. Again, it has a grain of truth, but it ain't the whole truth. And of course, it doesn't help that Netanyahu's government has just passed some thing which does not offer Palestinians, Arab people in Israel, who are in Israel, equal rights. They've denied the pursuit of certain anti-discrimination laws in Israel. So I think Israel, the state at the moment, is becoming really corrupted and fascistic. But that doesn't mean to say there aren't a lot of people who oppose it within Israel and oppose this thing. But there's so anyways, the analogy I don't think is completely right, because it completely elides the historic disproportionate number of Jews involved in the anti-apartheid movement relative to their numbers in South Africa. But aside from that, in theory, up until like last week, all people had were protected by the courts, and you did not have Black, as far as I know, you didn't have any Black MPs in apartheid South Africa, where you do have Arab MPs. So you do have representation, but it isn't. I mean, it isn't. And the courts have upheld cases of brutality and discrimination in favor of Arabs. So it isn't a pure apartheid state, but it's heading in that direction under Netanyahu. It has to be said, but it wasn't. And I think if you call it that and you simply demonize it, demonize Israel, particularly when it was under Rabin and people like that, under more liberal leaders, if you like. It really causes a defensive reaction and a feeling that Israel is simply being vilified. So I don't, and also the other thing that we have to take on board, which a couple of people from Zimbabwe have made remarks to me, is that the attitude towards Zimbabwean and other refugees coming into South Africa on the part of the on part of people in the majority Black communities, has been incredibly bigoted and racist in the persecution of other Black people because they're not one of us. Okay, so that kind of bigotry is not exclusive to white regimes. But the point is that when you have Western power so hegemonic, it can do the most damage. So in terms of the parallels between apartheid and in South Africa and Israel, it didn't obtain, and it was inappropriate, even though there has been widespread discrimination in practice until now. And I think now Netanyahu, like Trump and Modi and all these, Bolsonaro, they're all of the type, aren't they? And they all seem to have the same kind of mindset and authoritarian views. And so we are going to get increasing tendencies that make things more of an apartheid and authoritarian state wherever they are.
Yeah, there's again a lot to unpack there, and we might need a part 2 of this. Ella, did you had a question?
Mark had something. Mark Parker.
Mark, do you want to go first, and then we can finish up with Ella?
Yeah, if that's all right. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
So you mentioned a little while ago, it was to do with Labour anti-Semitism, the issue that some people had, the issue that some in the Labour Party had when raising the issue of anti-Semitism, the extreme backlash from the left that they then received. And then more recent to that, you mentioned the historical misrepresentation of Jews as like a globally wealthy group, and then the hatred or that then stimulates. And I wonder, to what extent this misrepresentation of Jews as a globally wealthy group might influence this undermining of the severity of anti-Semitism that we now feel in the present day. And, example of this that might be relevant, like Norman Finkelstein's Holocaust industry. I don't know whether it's anti-Semitic or not. I read it ages ago without any sort of critical eye. He prefaces his theory, which some have said is anti-Semitic, with basically an account now of American Jews as being this affluent group, wealthy in office in various levels, and winning Nobel Prizes and so on. And I wonder to what extent, this representation of Jews as this globally wealthy group has inhibited conversations about severity of anti-Semitism and maybe even undermined the importance that people on the left potentially ascribe to it.
I mean, I think there's a number of really interesting questions there that are packed into one. Well, first of all, the idea that all Jews are wealthy, even in America, is a bit of a misnomer, because you have a lot of white-collar Jews, you have a lot of, I think at this moment in history, Jews did very well because relative to a lot of other people, but that is masking, there are pockets of relative, non-affluence, but generally speaking, Jews are more in the lower middle class or white-collar working class or wealthy groups, okay? But they're not all wealthy, or they're not all very wealthy, that's for sure. If you looked at Israel, a third of Jews live below the poverty line. And a lot of those are the most extreme, the ones who want to settle in the settlements on occupied territory because the rents are cheaper, okay? And in Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, and in the Ukraine, well, there were a number of Jews who were, because of economic discrimination and anti-Semitism, not allowed to take up posts, etc. So the whole thing that all Jews are wealthy and how wealthy they are, I think is really misconceived. And I remember going to a mosque about 10 years ago. Some of the elders were concerned about radicalization amongst their youth, etc. And it was before Obama, it was just after Obama had been elected. And it was sort of said, well, all the Jews voted against Obama, didn't they? And I said, no, the Jews voted for Obama in greater numbers than any other group except African Americans. And they were surprised at that. And then I said, and not all Jews are wealthy, but they, because of capitalist economy favoring people who are literate, people who are educated, and people who are have particular communication, or historically, transport, retail, that kind of thing. Jews have been overrepresented in the lower and middle class, absolutely. And some Jews have gotten very wealthy, but they're a tiny minority, because most Jews are not wealthy, but they are, they're more, and now we're getting, as certain other areas of the economy grow in the creative media centers, we're beginning to get, a black middle class and black billionaires, even though most African Americans, because of their history of debt bondage and agricultural work and then debt bondage and racial discrimination, are overrepresented in the not just the working class, but the poor. So I think you'll have fewer Jews in the very, very poor category, but you'll have a lot of white-collar Jews and people, elderly people who are on benefits and things like that people don't know about or choose not to look at, and so that does obscure the the way, or that does tilt the way that Jews are seen. And then the point I made before is that just because you are in the middle classes does not make you immune to dehumanization and possible massacre, as we found out with the Jews who were the most assimilated were the German Jews in the 1930s. They had married in, they'd served in World War I. Although there were poor Jews within Germany, there were a lot of professional Jews, etc., and it didn't stop them from being victims of genocide.
I think, Lola, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did actually. I don't know if it's been addressed before, but a lot of Black people that I'm certainly around often don't see the fight against anti-Semitism as quote unquote our fight. So I wanted to ask, how much do you think why do you think it's so difficult for a lot of minorities to conceptualize and actually understand the full extent of the Jewish struggle? Is it potentially because to us, the majority of Jewish people who we come across in our daily lives are white passing? I wondered if that was a potential clause for why there's so much discontent between both minorities.
Question. I think there are a lot of different reasons. One is, white passing, and of course, increasingly as Jews became assimilated, they identify as whites. But that wasn't always the case. In the 18th century in Barbados, Jews were discriminated against. It's only they weren't allowed to own land and all that kind of thing, and they weren't allowed to vote, and et cetera, et cetera. So the status of Jews, it has changed. So that's one thing. Two, I think Black people in this country and in America particularly are looking at their life chances are just so constrained. The ability to earn a living and not be attacked by the police and all that kind of thing are just so much, in their face that, why are these people complaining? Why are these Jews complaining? Because their life chances are so much more constrained. So that's another reason. And there's also the historic relationship between Jews and Blacks as Jews as teachers, Jews in the music industry, Jews as landlords, etc., which were exploitative at one level, but actually it was more complicated than that, which we can go to in another way. But I think my son said, well, I think that people are so oppressed and so trying to particularly with this convergence of white supremacy and hate crime and economic disadvantage, etc., that they can't really see beyond their own group in order to see the common cause that they might have with the others. And I would only say that you only have to go to Williamsburg and that neo-Nazi rally to see that it wasn't just Black people who were being targeted, it was Jews. Okay, the Jews are controlling the Blacks, and that's what, and so there is a common cause here, but it isn't always very obvious on a day-to-day basis to both Blacks and Jews.
Great. Mark, thanks, Lola and Mark, for some really good ending questions. It's great to see them at Bristol University alumni as well, asking some very pointed and learned questions. I think that we've gone over a bit as we often do, but before we go, I'd just like to say thank you to Madge. I mean, it's so informative. There's so much we could extend on, and hope to have you again sometime. But thank you for your knowledge, for your time, and also, just as I mentioned in the introduction, for your years of dedication to this process. And and we're definitely building off some of the principles that you were central to, and that you have been central to your work for decades. So thank you. And if you have any closing remarks, like just to say, if you anything you want to say before we go, please go ahead. But I think everyone would join me in saying thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm sorry not to be. What I'd really like to do, but it's going to be a long-term thing, is to have some ready-made answers and sources that I could get you. I just don't have the capacity at the moment. But I really do thank you for listening. And I hope I've given you some food for thought. I'm sorry it's so complicated. I'm sorry I can't give you simple answers. There's a whole wealth of really interesting history, to unpack, and it's really fascinating. And I think the more we kind of explore each other's histories and each other's stories, the more enriched we'll be.
Definitely. Well, thank you, everyone. We obviously, most of you probably know our Instagram and everything else, but if you don't, please follow us Air Collective UK. We have a Patreon, so if you enjoy these events and everything else we're doing, which will be more throughout October and November, and throughout, please support us in any way you can. But thank you again to everyone, not just to Madge, but to everyone who's come and who's listened. And please don't, this doesn't end now. Take this on, build on these ideas, talk to your friends, talk to your family. Yeah. That's it.
It would just sort of say, it'd be really lovely to get the feedback of some of you who didn't say anything, just to, your own reactions and what daunted you or enraged you, or one thing they say, 2 Jews, 3 synagogues, and it would like a good argument, if I may generalize on behalf of the whole people. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.